Paul from Arkus Games, and in this video we'll be covering off the second sort of half of the pitch document that we put together for Shadow Moon Syndicates. The first half was very much more about the world design and what we were thinking from that world sort of context. But the second half is all about how we're going to take that creative vision into the game and the components for the game. And so I'll just launch straight into it in terms of the approach. So generally the next step we look at doing is we just do an overview of the game. It's pretty straightforward. We're just sort of blocking out in diagrammatic form all of the components that we know of at this stage. Now, bear in mind, this is very early in the process. At this stage, Sam hadn't even sort of joined the team at this stage for the development side of the game. But it was important for us to kind of, I guess, agree on the vision for the game and the world, and also bring Jay up to speed on what we were planning. So at this stage of the game, before Sam got his hands on it, this was kind of where things were at in terms of the components. And it's really important too, because we were obviously wanting to try to lock some of the concepts around the number of players, the number of how much time, and the age is really important. And in fact, there was a change. I believe we're now 2 to 5 rather than 3 to 6. So you can see how things can change over the course of a development of a game. So one of the key things we want to think about is the user experience and how they navigate around a game and the rule book. And a lot of that has to do, from a creative side of things, has to do with the graphic design approach and how we use information graphics and graphic design and color to help people navigate. It's very similar to the work I've done in video game. And so one of the things we want to do was try to control the color, because the factions, there's a lot of color with the factions. We tried giving each faction a subtle color theming, but there's like 15 factions. So the danger is you can start getting kind of like a rainbow colored game. So what we decided pretty early on was we wanted to try to rein in the color a little bit and control it. So whenever we're seeing game components like the game board or the cards, where and the rule book, we're often trying to play with this idea of this yellow and in this case we changed from yellow and black to yellow and grey, which is kind of like a classic information sign sort of color combo. You'll see it in airports and road signs. And it's kind of a fun, quite striking color palette. What we also wanted to do was sort of start thinking about the player colors. Obviously, there's a lot of challenges around color blindness with some colors, and the only real way we can sort of solve that problem, other than doing a little bit of research around color testing for color blindness, but the problem is there's so many different types of color blindness that it's very difficult to cater for every type. So our general solution is to always make sure that there is an icon that goes with the color, an individual icon. So that way, if someone is having some challenges sort of seeing what color their token is, they've also got an icon that can help them. And it's a really important part of designing board games, is allowing for that, because we want everyone to have a good experience. And there's nothing more frustrating than not being able to tell your own influence token from someone else's. So this is our solution. But what we thought might be quite fun is that the influence tokens are kind of just about more in the fluorescent color range, which is a completely different color range to anything else we did in the game. And my hope was from the outset that we might be able to use semi-translucent acrylic tokens to get that kind of punchy sort of semi-translucent color. Okay, illustrations. So a huge part of the game is the faction illustrations. We're looking at 10 base game factions and a further 5 for the expansion. So that's 15 factions. Each faction has 10 cards. And one of the ideas I came up with pretty early on was rather than just doing a scattergun approach to each illustration on each card, I thought it would be really fun. It's quite a subtle thing, but a fun thing to try to come up with a formula that kind of dictates the positioning of the character on each faction. And so the idea I came up with was that starting on the far left, you start in a profile, close-up profile, and then you sort of slowly move the character, rotate the character forward to the camera. And the middle card in the set of 7 is a real close-up front close up, and then you slowly pull the camera back out again and rotate the character the other direction. Um, and so this was just, and obviously you'd never notice this unless you put all of the characters in the correct order, which is not something you'd ever do during gameplay. But from a marketing perspective, we thought it could be quite a nice way to sort of showcase each faction. And also from an art briefing perspective, when we're bringing on other artists, it really helps them sort of choose, speed up the process so that they know kind of what kind of pose they need to sort of be looking at. We wanted to make sure that you could always do variations within this structure, but it is something that we kind of used as a structure for the whole thing. Now, what about the other three? The other three, Shem suggested early on, because we had a lot of cards to illustrate, he suggested that perhaps one of the cards, three of the cards, could have a shared illustration, which we thought could be quite a fun way to tie to the Bob concept and the idea of surveillance, that each one of these illustrations is kind of like is obviously one of the agents, and that Bob is his basically recording and surveilling these agents and tracking them for information purposes. And so we thought having illustrating one of Bob's sort of like tech nests where he's got all of his monitoring stations and sort of like a control center could be kind of fun. And we did that, but then in game testing with Sam, Sam said that it was confusing players, that each of the powers were separate for these three cards. They were different powers, but they had the same illustration. It was confusing. And so taking that on board, we ended up doing a different control room illustration for each of those three cards. And in terms of the actual graphic design for the cards, for the faction cards, this was pretty much Dane's first pass. You'll see some of the artwork is quite old. It's kind of more of a first pass artwork. But in terms of the graphic design, these didn't change very much from the final. In fact, I'll bring up the final now. You can see that's the final design for the back and front. So if I just swap between the two, you can see it's very close. So that's the benefit of one of these kind of documents, is that you can really map out the look of the game quite early on, and it can be a really good roadmap to follow straight to the end, sometimes with very few changes. And so this was kind of obviously Dane's graphic design pass. We love the idea, like we did in Storm Raiders, of using the backs of cards as a piece of technology. We're trying to keep things in world as much as possible. We love, one of our objectives was to come up with some bold graphic design and logos that intentionally overlay the illustration. Originally, we had this vertical bar on the left-hand side and the faction logo to the right, but Jay and Sam reminded us that when you put a card hand together, you tend to fan to the right, and you want to see the faction logo top left. It's really important from a hand management perspective. So that was something that we needed to quickly correct very early on. So that's, you can sort of get a sense of how the faction cards sort of moved along from there. Objective cards, this was a big change. This actually changed entirely once Sam started developing the game, and we actually ended up reusing the artwork and design for more of what we called the trait cards, which were basically like a player aid to help you make some decisions on which faction you might like to include in the game, because each game you can include a number of factions, not all of them. So it's important that players can maybe make some quick decisions. And so this was a fun way of taking something that became a bit obsolete in the original version of the game and still reusing it, and for it to not be lost. And you can sort of see that we just changed the card design. We kept the graphic design quite similar, but we changed the information entirely, so that now it's more about telling the player which is the faction, in this case Feral. Their home sector is Underhive. They're a violent street gang. Just a quick overview of exactly what they're about. How the aggression factor and complexity of how hard it is to play the deck effectively, and also just Jay came up with a lovely little succinct sentences for each of the factions that kind of tell you the cut and thrust of what the kind of gameplay power and ability is that they lean into. So, because of course every faction is kind of asymmetrical in its design. And then the awesome piece of tech that Dane worked up on the reverse side of that card. You can see that changed quite a bit from this one. Okay, and then for the next set of cards, the operation cards, these became objective cards. And again, Sam made some quite big developments. Some of these concepts moved into tokens on the board, which was kind of helpful because it started bringing the attention more back onto the board, because there's already a lot of cards to track in this game as it is. You can see that we sort of shuffle things around. The tech back of this one ended up becoming the tech back of the trait cards, and we sort of took the previous cards back and put it onto these cards. So there's a lot of sort of moving and shuffling around. But if you can sort of see where we got to with the objective cards, you can see we definitely kept a similar level of graphic design, but this was probably one of the hardest design solves which I had to work on, which was probably about 6 or 7 attempts to get the right layout and hierarchy of information so that people could read that information really clearly across the board to where they're located. So it's this kind of usability that can take a long time to get right. This one was a bit of a painful process with Sam going back and forth, because we were both trying to desperately get it right, but everything that I tried just wasn't quite hitting the mark. And that's where working closely with the developer is a really helpful part of the process, because you're relying on their experience to tell you where it's not working, in play testing. Thankfully, we did get there in the end. Just a note as well, from a design perspective, you always have to be careful of bleed. When things get printed at the factory, you generally need to allow for like a 3 millimeter bleed and an internal margin of about 2 millimeters, so that way when things move slightly on the press, when they're trimming cards, that you don't accidentally cut off information, which is really important. So you can see we've been quite generous with the borders on this one to make sure that we're keeping all that information well and truly in the sort of center of the card, and that's something that obviously Nicola does all of our sort of print setup for manufacture, and so I'm working closely with her to make sure that my designs and components are fitting within those margins. And often she'll come back to me and say, look, you need to change it. There's a chance this is going to get cut off, and I'm sort of roll my eyes and have to go back and change it again. But it's just part of the process, because if we don't get it right, you don't get a good quality game. Okay, and then let's go to the next step. We've got game board. So this was a very early design I sort of mocked up. I was kind of hoping Dane would take the lead role on designing the tech side of it, because he'd done all the backs of the cards, and it's good to sort of let another designer sort of take the lead on stuff if you want that kind of consistent look. So I focused on designing the map, but both me and Dane threw down a whole bunch of ideas for the tech around it. And what tended to happen is I would throw down an idea, Dane would paint back over it, and then I'd take it and paint back over his one until we kind of landed on something we liked. And that sort of collaborative approach is really important, because that's part of the process in terms of getting the best result. And as a small team, it's really important. So this was kind of our favorite block in design for the board. It's very crude, but at this game pitch level, this was enough to be able to tell Jay and Sam and Nicola that we were thinking of putting these cards along the top, and they were going to have little slot kind of markers. We're going to have the kind of faction river at the bottom. We were going to have these, I think at the time we were going to put some of the objective cards off to the right, but that's now become the burn pile. And we were going to have the draw deck for the syndicates here, and that stayed the same. And if you just want to get a sense of just how some of the key things that we were wanting to sort of push from a creative perspective was technology is really important, that we give this high-tech look. We wanted to make sure that we had a built-in round tracker. and that the sector names pop and are really clear to read. And in fact, we went back on this quite a few times. If I just show you the final design, you can sort of see how much it levels up once we start doing all the pretty pass. Um, but also you can see that we spend a lot of time with Sam and when in the play testing to make sure that each one of these sector locations was really quite big on the board, so that it was really easy to read. Um, we used inverse text to make it pop a little bit more on the board, so that we get that really strong color contrast to make sure that these things pop, because obviously, and also making sure those sector boundaries are really clear to read as well. From a design perspective, you'd probably want to make it more subtle and make it look cooler. But from a gameplay perspective, we just had to keep increasing the weighting and the pop of those borders, because we found that if we didn't do that, it was too hard for players to really clearly understand where they could put their influence. So this is one of those balancing acts that you constantly have as a designer and artist, is that sort of like back and forth with game development, is ensuring that it's usable for the player. That's got to be the most important part of it. Aesthetics is important, but it's got to be usable aesthetics, and that's a big part of the development process. And then just about through on this, but finally the game box. You can see this is actually quite different from a color perspective to our final game box. We love the idea. We had obviously got, literally, dozens and dozens of illustrations from each of the syndicates. And so we thought it'd be really fun to play into that concept of sort of carving off a framing device to start to put as many of those cool characters onto the box cover as possible. Because we felt that was the real selling point from a visual perspective for the game. And we wanted to get the sense of diversity as well, like a really interesting mix of characters from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different age groups, different professions. The fact that not all of them are humans, some of them are robots. So we really wanted to push that sense of interest through diversity. But what we did realize is that the yellow and grey was not really working for the cover. We wanted something that was going to be a little bit more of a pop. And so we ended up going for, to bring up the final, we went for more of a sort of red, rose red sort of color for the background to get a stronger contrast for the yellow of the logo. And so this was like the color palette that we kind of adopted for more of our marketing materials, which was something that we were really glad that we kind of pushed ourselves to do, because it just seemed to have so much more pop and felt a lot more interesting visually. But you can see that the actual design of the box didn't vary a great deal, and it was really just updating and with finished artwork and just sort of refining a few of those graphic design tweaks that Dane had done. But by and large, very similar. Anyway, I'll finish things off here. But I hope you've enjoyed kind of like a sneak peek behind the scenes at what we do in terms of like proposing how we approach a game from a visual design sort of side of things. And we'll look forward to showing more of the development as we go forward. Anyway, thanks for listening and take care.